Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And before I do my standard intro, a bit of housekeeping. Just always click like and subscribe. Make sure that you share what we're doing on social media. A friend of mine, Sander, just hit his 100,000 subscribers. And I want to get there sometime in the next few weeks or while I'm alive. So make sure you do that. And also, you may have missed the earlier show today because when I do the ones that are morning UK or evening Australia, they sometimes get lost in the algorithm. But Joan Beaumont gave an absolutely incredible presentation about the prisoners of war and Ambon. It's definitely worth going back and looking at. But right now, we have covered the Soviet offensives of 1944 on the channel quite a lot, including Bagration. But there was a large-scale attack in 1943 that gets far less attention. Chris Mainwaring joins me to talk about that First Belorussian Offensive of October 1943. He is a graduate of the Wolverhampton War Studies, so he's been there with Hugh Davie and John Buckley and other incredible figures. So I'm looking forward to bringing him in. So good evening, Chris. How are you today?
Hello, I'm very good, thank you. I hope everyone is okay.
Yeah, so we were just chatting there about the fact that you're going into the Eastern Front, you know, with no family connection, no particular reason. It's not like you grew up in the Russian steppes, but Eastern Front is a massive, great subject to start. And I know when you get into your slides, you're going to talk about some of your sources and things like that. But I feel sometimes that when I was your age and younger, that the Battle of Normandy seemed enormous. But can it be a bit overwhelming when you look at the Eastern Front and just how vast it was and the size and the number of units, and just think I could never kind of dig my way into that subject?
Yeah, it does seem rather baffling, especially when you're used to like the ETO, for example, or indeed during this time period we're looking at today, the things that are happening in Italy, for example. You look at the amount of divisions, Allied divisions in Italy, compared to on the Eastern Front during this time period. It's just staggering the difference, like what you kind of get used to.
Yeah, like telephone number, sort of size formations and millions here, millions there. But anyway, folks, we're going to bring up the PowerPoint. There's a lot of detail, a lot of information, a lot of maps, a lot of bullet points. Please, of course, feel free to fire away with questions about specific details. But if there's any big, broad ones about the whole concept of studying this era, then we can save them for them. But I'm going to hand over to Chris to take us through this. So there we are. First slide. Over to you, sir.
Yep. So before I start, there'll be some bullet points on the screen, but that's not required. I'll be talking about it all anyway. So first of all, just thought I'd put something down about who I am. As Woody's already said, I'm a graduate from the University of Wolverhampton on the Second World War course, which is brilliant, and I would recommend to anybody. And what I'll be talking about today is part of the subject of my dissertation, which is which was a comparative essay between the First Belorussian Offensive and the a lot more famous Operation Bagration. And I've just got some social media links there if anyone's interested. I am planning on writing some stuff on my Substack about this in some shorter snippets.
Brilliant.
Yep. So to get into it, when we talk about Belarus in the Second World War, like if you were to Google it, for example, you'll most likely see Operation Bagration, and that it was liberated in the massive offensive in June 1944. And we typically get this because we see the Second World War through the lens of big battles. You know, we'll jump from one to the other, and there's nothing wrong with this, of course, because you know you need to come up with some kind of digestible way of telling the history, and the big battle history can be quite a good one. And of course, we see Operation Bagration for that reason, an absolutely massive offensive, the destruction of Army Group Center and covering several hundred kilometers. But because of this, then obviously we miss out things in between, and that narrative, it doesn't often talk about the fact that before this, the Red Army has effectively tried to do the same thing 5 months earlier in October of 1943. And that kind of gets lost. And we don't often get to see that within the context of Bagration, which I think is very important. A lot of the time.
Hence why you're here then. Brilliant.
Yes.
It's almost like we planned it.
Yes. So from there, another way that you can kind of frame the war, if you like, was the way from the Soviet High Command's perspective. And from their perspective, you could look at it from the list of all of the frontline operations that they've conducted throughout the war to try and get a better picture of how they viewed it through their operations. And if you do that, you get a big list of operations. And amongst that, you start to see some of the offensives that make up this First Belarusian Offensive, if you want to use that name for it. But even then, amongst that official Soviet canon, you only see a few of the constituent offensives that make up this overall offensive. So even then, you don't see them all. And so from that, you could make the argument that is this the First Belarusian Offensive? Because if the canon doesn't see it as such, you could make that argument. But and as we'll get onto the historiography on this slide, I think you can make quite a good point that it is a big combined offensive. And looking at some of the pictures on the screen of some of the books, we could start with really where we first hear about it would be in the Soviet official histories. There's been 4 editions with each with several volumes, and they all mention, including the most recent one, which isn't that long ago, relatively speaking. They do recognize the existence, but they're not typically very candid about it, and maybe only mention 1 or 2 of the offensives that were more successful and not really mention anything else. So from there, we get in 1994, we get General Garyaev, who was actually, I believe he was on the staff of one of the armies on the Western Front in this offensive at the time. He wrote an article and he talked about it in detail for the first time. And from there, we have in 2014, there was a Russian and Belarusian piece covering the liberation of Belarus, and that was that covers it in its entirety, but this features heavily. And then, of course, we have probably the most prominent example in the English historiography, which is David Glantz's book from 2016. And that one really puts forward the argument that this was a large-scale offensive and that the Stavka had high hopes for this offensive, opposed to it being this kind of, we did a couple of attacks, they didn't go as well as we'd liked, and then focus on Ukraine. Well, we'll get a bit more into that later. And then I thought I'd also put a picture on there, Germany in the Second World War, Volume 8. That one actually came out in 2018. And that has a good 40-page chapter on this offensive that I would say is a pretty good overall view. 40 pages, it's not that deep. And then as well, I've left Rokossovsky as an example, his memoir, because everyone's memoirs are really useful in uncovering more stuff about this. They were like a gold mine. Whenever you wanted to maybe find out something new, if you saw that a certain general took part, find their memoir, they've probably written something about it. And in this case, they did. There's Rokossovsky's is a good example. There's plenty of other people too.
And we had just a question come in, I think it's worth mentioning now, about with the memoirs of generals, is that, how much of this wasn't mentioned because certain generals were not the favorites or being talked about perhaps after war, post-time, because, with the Western allies, there was no general who wasn't allowed to write his memoirs. I can't think of any general, well, Germans obviously, but there no West allies who were like imprisoned or deported or something like that. So is there a factor of the fact that certain Russian generals ended up coming out not being very popular and therefore couldn't do their memoirs?
Yeah, that definitely was the case. But I would say particularly, and this points get raised in David Glantz's book, and you can have everyone can have their own opinion on it. But the idea that he poses in his book is that generally the reason why we don't know very much about this offensive was because of the failure of it. And at the time, Sokolovsky, who was one of the front commanders, he was, I believe, he was the chief of staff of the Soviet armed forces at the time, and he was part of the defense committee. And he'd also written a book about Soviet operational art in the 70s. So it doesn't really reflect very well on your military if you publish this, if this is well known about how his forces didn't perform very well. But then that, of course, means that Rokossovsky, who was also part of this offensive, one of his fronts, you don't learn about what he was doing either.
Good point. I think I was just going to let you go, hand it back to you, but I had this discussion with Indian Idel a couple of years ago. Is we're also, those of us who aren't experts on the Eastern Front, we're rather burdened by the fact we like the city battles. We like the battles that have names. We like to think of Stalingrad and Leningrad and Kursk and things like that. And we don't, I think of the Soviet battles in that sort of operational way. Even like we Westernized, we refer to Anzio and Salerno rather than the code names of the operations. We don't talk about Shingle, and I think we're like giving tanks names as opposed to using their numerical designations. I think it doesn't help, especially when the code names of the Soviet operations don't translate very well or they're a bit unwieldy. I think it's easy to just kind of focus on, the battle for the steppes or the battle for the Volga or the battle, give it like a geographical name. And even in the sidebar, people saying, is this Belarus or Belarus? Because there's a wartime designation for that term, and the current, it gets a bit muddy, which is complicated. But
I should probably say the reason why I've used Belorussia in that spelling is because at the time it was the Russian spelling for the Belarusian Soviet Republic. So that's why I'm using that spelling.
Fantastic. Well, are we moving on? Next slide.
Yes, please.
Back to you.
So before we get into the actual offensive, we'll just talk a little bit about what actually happened before the strategic situation. So, of course, in the summer of 1943, we have the Battle of Kursk. And at this point, it was the first time the Soviets had stopped the German summer offensive before it reached strategic depths. And from that point, it then enabled them to launch their own counteroffensive in the summer instead of having to do so in the winter. And from there, they launched the subsequent offensives that pushed the German forces back to the Dnieper River. And from there, they were the plan was to then conduct strategic offensives in two strategic directions into Belarus and Ukraine. It's worth mentioning a strategic direction, just in case anybody doesn't know. They're basically the equivalent to an army group, and the name of the strategic direction would typically be the main axis of attack. So in this instance today, we're talking about the Western strategic direction. So would be in Belarus, and the Southwestern strategic direction in Ukraine, for example, today. And whilst this was happening in the summer, in August, Hitler had decided that he wanted to resurrect the idea of the East Wall, which was a series of field fortifications that ran all the way down from the south of the Ukraine, all the way up to the north in Estonia. And in the middle, in Army Group Center, it was codenamed the Panther positions. And of course, from Kursk, it was made clear that German forces, because they couldn't achieve a major operational success on the Eastern Front anymore after Operation Citadel, their posture had changed from offensive to defensive, and that was why it kind of informed that decision to resurrect the idea of the East Wall. So if we move on to the next one, I've got a map on the next slide, and this one just very quickly that details from the 19th of September to the 2nd of October, which is roughly when the offensive begins, the amount of ground that the Red Army actually covers to get to where it is. at the beginning of the offensive. That blue dotted line is the position that the Germans are occupying, and that broadly is the Panther position there, the line of field fortifications. And something I just wanted to point out before we move on from this one, you can see the vast distance that the Red Army cover from, like, Kursk is on the bottom right there, and in the top right there's Moscow, and this is just towards the end of September that they've covered this vast distance. In the months before that, since Kursk, they've also fought their way across. And it's also worth mentioning, actually, that this date, it begins when the Germans had chosen to withdraw to the Panther position. Right. So that's another reason why the Soviets cover such a huge amount of ground, because they're actually pursuing the Germans at this point, the end of this Battle of Smolensk, and they choose to fall back. But nonetheless, it kind of highlights the speed that they cover in such a short period amount of time, and are then expected to continue an offensive into Belarus. So if we go on to the next slide. As I've mentioned, the Stavka, they choose to conduct offensives simultaneously in two strategic directions, in the western and southwestern, which would be Belarus, and in the Ukraine. And the Stavka ordered the Western strategic direction to destroy Army Group Center and capture Minsk, with their broader objectives based on each one of the three fronts would be to capture Vilnius, it would be to capture Riga, and also Slutsk, which is roughly in line with where Minsk is. So that was a depth of up to 300 kilometers in some areas. And for anybody that is familiar with Operation Bagration, you might see that order is pretty much the same, what they're being told to do there, to what they will be later be told to do with Operation Bagration. And these offensives, both of the strategic directions, would conduct their offensive simultaneously. So that would be a front of about 1,100 kilometers conducting offensives all at the same time. But within that, the fronts, their offensives typically were sequential. And I think we don't necessarily have any particular kind of evidence to suggest why they would do this. But in part, I would argue that it's because of the sheer amount of forces that are active at any given time, and to enable these forces to actually conduct these offensives. Of course, it has their operational value as well in terms of manipulating German reserves around and then following with subsequent offensives. But we'll get into that a bit more with this offensive. I've just outlined there the kind of axis of attacks of the three fronts that are taking part in this offensive. The First Baltic Front in the north would attack on the Vitebsk axis, the Western Front in the middle, the Orsha-Mogilev axis, and then the Central Front, which is renamed to the Belarusian Front, on the Minsk axis, with its primary objective being Bobruisk. As we move on to the next slide, this is the Stavka directive that was actually sent to the this was for the Western Front, but it outlines all of the objectives for the three fronts on the 1st of October. And you can see that it's pretty basic. It tells them what their objectives are, but the front commanders need to come back to the Stavka with their plans, and that outlines what they're supposed to be doing. It's worth noting that this is the Stavka directive that actually expands their objectives to Lithuania, Estonia, and deeper, which I'll get onto in a moment. They're originally told that they're going to be conducting this offensive around about the 20th September. So at the time, they're actually pursuing the Germans to their current positions. So that's the kind of how quickly the time frame is for this, and I'll explain a bit why that might be
echoes of Market Garden, in a sense, that a year later.
Yes.
In that they're pursuing the enemy, but also planning. So they don't know how far and how fast the enemy are going to be moving in front of them. Well, they probably do have an idea where they're going to defend, but they're also planning their next offensive before the enemy have even got into position for the offensive. So it's,
yeah,
because we just had the question about how much time did they put into the planning. But if the situation is still fluid, the plan has to have quite a lot of wriggle room. Even though it's a massive, great, the size of the front are enormous, but it's still got to have some amount of a wriggle room, because you're not 100% sure of the situation when you actually fire the starting gun pistol.
Yeah, we'll actually get to the amount of time in a moment, so in a couple of slides I'll answer that question. So if we move on to the next one, I'll just get into the Red Army, the front commanders and the German front commanders. You might see some familiar faces on this one, particularly Rokossovsky, I would say, but the arrow there signifies the fact that Yeremenko, who was the front commander of the First Baltic Front, he was replaced by Ivan Bagration. But I'll just go over them quickly. Yeremenko, Sokolovsky, and Rokossovsky at this point were all considered to be experienced front commanders, whereas Bagration at this point was an experienced army commander, and when he's actually promoted to the front commander of the First Baltic, this is his first front command. And if I were to replace one person, I wouldn't have replaced the Yeremenko, which we'll get into a bit more later. I think he was rather unfairly replaced, and if anyone should have been replaced, it probably should have been Sokolovsky. But that's up for historiographical debates that we can get onto. It's something that I just wanted to mention quickly, which I found quite interesting about these four commanders, was that they are a decent representation of the kind of multi-ethnic background of the Red Army at this point. They're not Russians. Yeremenko is of Ukrainian descent. Bagration is of Armenian descent. Sokolovsky is of Belarusian descent, but he was born in Poland. And Rokossovsky was of Polish descent. So there's a real mix here of people from all over the Soviet Union, none of which are actually of Russian descent.
Yeah, they all became marshals at some point. So that weird thing of they're from outside of the core, but yet they can progress to the highest level. It's fascinating. Moving on, Germans.
Yep. So with the Germans again, there'll be some familiar faces here for some people. On the left, I've got the Army Group commanders, plural, because von Kluger is actually replaced very early on, within the first month, but that's not because of any kind of operational failure. That's actually because he was in a car accident, and he's replaced by Bush, which might be familiar to people from Operation Bagration. And for him, he doesn't act any different now from how he does in Operation Bagration. That to say that he doesn't really have much of an inspired command and basically repeats Hitler's orders, which isn't very helpful.
Pripitar's not exactly effusive about Bush's qualities.
That's the short summary. It's pretty much the same now. So the reason, and on the right hand side, I've actually decided to include the army commanders for the Germans, because they only have the 4 armies. The Soviets have 19 armies, and I think we'd be here a while if I decided to go through all of those. Again, there's some familiar faces there, particularly Model and Reinhardt. Interestingly, Heinrici, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name.
That's how it's been said in this channel before. He's an interesting figure. He's worthy of a massive, great rabbit hole that we're not going to go into, but yeah.
Yes, he is, yes. He is one of those generals where the simple version, shall we say, is that he didn't have very good PR after the war, and that's probably why he's not so well known about, because he does have a very good reputation as a defensive commander, particularly, and I would say that pretty much comes from this offensive, in my opinion. So if we move on to the next one, we can get into the opposing forces of the two sides. I've got a table there for comparison. So for the Germans, an army group center, they have 914,500 men. That number in brackets there is actually, it's an estimated number of their actual combat strength. So, but then also it's worth noting that they had up to 100,000 civilians and local auxiliaries that were part of the army group that were used in constructing the Panther positions. So again, that inflates the numbers of personnel for Army Group Centre. It may not have been up to 100,000, but at the very least, we know that those numbers aren't all going to be combat troops or service personnel, and they have a very small amount of reserves. And from what I could tell, looking at these figures, at this point, every army group had that exact same number as reserves, which would lead me to believe that there was actually maybe only one division, and it would have got sent to whichever one needed it, opposed to actually this being its exclusive reserves. In terms of armor, they had 594 armored vehicles, but 216 of them were operational. In terms of the old means of combat, if you want to use that word, they had a rather healthy amount of artillery, and they had 434 aircraft. But comparing that to the Soviets, of course, you can already see there's a large discrepancy there. The Soviets had 1.5 million men, and then they also had a considerable amount of reserves compared to the Germans. The figures on armor, I decided to use 3 figures there, but I'll go into them. The figures that the Germans provided for their armor was that middle figure there, that 1,320 armored vehicles. But their figure for Soviet reserves was 1,700, which would mean that they would have had 3,000, which seems like a lot more than that they would have actually had, because at this point, the tank armies were withdrawn to the front and they were refitting after the Kursk and the subsequent operations. So that's probably too many. That first number is from the Soviet official history, but that doesn't include reserves. And that third number is David Glantz's number, which is his estimate of front and reserves. Either way, you can choose any one of those 3 figures. The Soviets have a lot more armor than the Germans do. Best case scenario, if we take that lowest number, it's still not looking. It's nowhere near even.
No, but it's that old, the old cliche is that you need to have 3-to-1 superiority when you're attacking. And we tend to think of the Soviets as having almost unlimited numbers of troops. Yeah. It is kind of pretty much 2-to-1, 3-to-1, those data. But that for an offensive, that's not massive. I'm sure people are, although the Soviets have more, they don't have crazy amounts more. I know there's going to be less stuff German coming through, and the reserves figure is really interesting there. And it's only going to, as the months and weeks and pass, it's only going to get worse for the Germans and theoretically better for the Soviets. But it's only traditional superiority for an attack, isn't it? 3-to-1 is what you'd expect, and these days, 2025, you'd expect it to be 5-to-1 if you're doing it. So it's interesting how they're not as far apart as I thought those figures might have been.
Yeah, and I'll get onto that shortly when we get into armored vehicles specifically. But the reason, a large reason for that is because the tank armies are currently refitting, but then when they're actually sent back to the fronts, they're sent to Ukraine. They're not sent to Belarus, so that kind of informs that even more. And then you can see there in terms of artillery and aircraft, the Soviets have a lot more of both of those as well. And just very quickly to go over some of the bullet points I've got on the side there. The previous Battle of Smolensk caused 450,000 casualties in the Western and Kalinin fronts. So, and also against the Army Group Centre that was fighting them at this point as well, they'd suffered a considerable amount of casualties in the period leading up to this. And von Kluge, that little quote I included there, that von Kluge actually wrote in a letter directly to Hitler saying that Army Group Centre needed 200,000 more men. He painted quite a bleak picture, really, for a letter directly to Hitler, but he follows that up at the end by saying morale is good. I don't know whether that was true or not at the time when he wrote that. I don't know whether he was trying to make it seem better than it was, because they were in a pretty dire situation. And as well, for the Soviets, they had an estimated about 150,000 partisans in the winter of 43-44 behind the lines in Belarus. And this was actually, I think it was in September and October, there was Operation Concert, which was the massive rail sabotage operation that happened at the start of this offensive. So that was somewhat in conjunction with this offensive. So getting onto the planning and the preparation for the offensive, they all had this shared objective, which was effectively a three-pronged attack from the north, center, and the south to converge on Minsk. The fronts largely conduct separate offensives without really any coordination. To begin with, they launch these offensives pretty much on the same day, on the 2nd of October. But when one of them maybe doesn't achieve its objective, that might stop at a different point to another one. So from there, you kind of get this, it all just becomes out of kilter. One of them might last 2 weeks, one of them might last 10 days, and then they're asked to proceed again within the next 5 days, but then they're not starting at the same time as each other. And that allows the Germans to move their reserves around because they're fighting battles that are starting at separate times on separate parts of the front. And I would argue that part of the reason for this was because there were no Stavka representatives at any of the fronts until January 1944. And the Stavka representatives would have been someone sent directly from the Stavka, the high command, with the authority, if needed, to take direct control and also then to coordinate fronts on their overall objectives. But they didn't get one until January 1944. And it changed in March. The issue is that Voronov and Timoshenko, they were both only sent to coordinate the Western Front and the First Baltic Front's operations together. They weren't sent to coordinate with the Belarusian front in the south. And on that one as well, I find it really interesting to note that in November, when the Germans counterattack at Zhytomyr in Ukraine, Rokossovsky is actually sent as a Stavka representative to First Ukrainian Front, and which he says in his memoir he's quite embarrassed about because he's being sent to be a Stavka representative over somebody that's the same rank as him on his bordering front. He goes and he does it, but he says he's embarrassed and he didn't really want to do it. But bearing in mind, this is also happening during this offensive in the November. He's got his own front to manage, and Stalin's rung him up on the phone and asked him to go to Ukraine to be a Stavka representative there, which wasn't particularly helpful at the time. And as I've already mentioned briefly, that they were forced to plan their offensives whilst they were on the move in late September. And the timescale they were given, they were given about 2 weeks to achieve their objectives, their initial objectives, which was quite a quick time frame. And which kind of, this then leads me on to the overarching kind of point that I will come back to a lot today. So I apologize if you hear me say it a lot, but which goes back to the question that was asked earlier, was that they didn't have any kind of significant operational pause. They had pursued the Germans to their current position on the 2nd of October. And from then, pretty much continuously, the Red Army had been on the offensive since the Battle of Kursk. So that's about, I believe it's 2.5 months, 3 months. And so then they're expected to do another large-scale offensive into Belarus. And as you can see there, the Western Front, which is just one of the 3 fronts throughout the entire offensive, that 5-6 month period of this offensive, it conducts 11 offensives, and and the average time between them was 15 days, but that's the average time. Sometimes they were given maybe like 6 days preparation, but we're talking a front that has 8 armies with hundreds of thousands of men that has just failed, has taken casualties, needs time to replenish, and they're being asked to do it again. And I can get into a bit more later the reasoning why the Stavka might have decided to do this, because of course we have to remember we can look at it with hindsight now, can't we? But it's a bit different at the time for the Stavka why they may have chose to do it this way. And
for me, just jumping in my opinion, it seems they're a bit between a bit of a rock and a hard place in that you've only got a few weeks before the dreaded mud and all that kind of stuff comes, but at the same time the Germans are falling back, so that it would seem you have to take advantage of that somehow. And if you didn't move at all and just kind of stabilize the front, then you've got to wait till the spring, and that seems crazy along. So it feels again, it's echoes of Market Garden in the sense that, if you don't do something, people say, why aren't you doing something? But if you do something and it goes wrong, people say, why did you do that then? It seems that the planners of this they're in an impossible situation in some way.
That is the big fear. Yeah, that's the big fear for the Stavka, really. They fought so hard to gain the initiative. This is the first time they've had the initiative, really, since Operation Barbarossa. So they fought so hard to gain the initiative, they're terrified of losing it again. And that kind of informs this decision to just maintain pressure everywhere. And then if something comes out of it, exploit that, whatever it may be. And
when you say it like that, it sounds sound. It was a terrible sentence, but it sounds workable. Often the things that don't work very well, the original concept sounds okay, and then it's but of course it was doomed, but are we moving next one? Are we moving on?
I'll just do the last couple of points, but you can move it on. Basically, and that also causes massive problems logistically, because the front has to catch up several hundreds of kilometers. But now we're getting into the autumn and we're getting into the winter, so you get the classic, it wouldn't be an Eastern Front talk without talking about the weather. And it rained, the weather was awful. It rained heavily, but then it maintained above normal temperature in the November when it would begin to freeze. So that meant that it continued to rain later into November. So the roads just became an absolute nightmare. Normally, even though snow presents its own troubles offensively, it does harden the ground out and you can then use the roads. But if it just continued to rain more into the November, which just made it an absolute nightmare for them to get logistics to the front. And Gorbatov, who was one of Rokossovsky's army commanders, he writes in his memoir that it could take up to 2 weeks for a truck to reach them, which just seems... I mean, it just seems crazy to me. In that time, you could have conducted an offensive and being asked to conduct another one. And in that time, the truck that has left by the time the first one, your first offensive started, has only just got there. So everything's just lagging. Everything's lagging behind.
That's a really interesting point, because we just had a question about the logistics, which you're handling really well. So well, onwards and upwards.
Yep. In terms of the actual planning, it represented a kind of a typical plan for the new or returning Soviet operational art of deep battle. The plan was to concentrate powerful forces in the breakthrough areas that staggeringly outnumbered the Germans. I saw some figures that would be like artillery would be like 17 times to 1 advantage in the Soviet favor in the breakthrough area, not across the entire front, but just in the breakthrough area. Just absolutely staggering figures. It would be less so in infantry and armor, but still normally 3 to 5 times, which is still obviously not great if you're the defender. And the Stavka directives, they aided with these concentrations. Sometimes if they didn't like the look of a plan, they'd write a directive, or if an offensive had failed, they'd write a directive and say, move this brigade here, move this armored corps here, so on, so on. The issue is that on the Western Front and to a lesser extent the First Baltic Front, they didn't really make any effort to mislead the Germans. The Germans pretty much always knew when an attack was coming, and they pretty much always knew where it was coming. Part of the reason was just because they could see with their own reconnaissance what was happening, but part of the reason was because they didn't really vary their axes of attack. They'd normally use the same 1 to 3 axes depending on where they were, but not really many more outside of that. And that manifested particularly on the Western Front. And because of the pace of these operations without the operational pause, a lot of replacements that were being sent to the front, they weren't being given time to be properly briefed on what was going on. Some units, and this happened at the First Baltic Front as well, and the Belarusian Front, they would be sent to the front line on the march. They'd march there, they'd just got there, and they'd be told, right, come on, you're in the offensive. But we've just marched like 20 kilometers to get here. We've got no idea what's going on, and we're in this offensive. So, and the results were quite predictable from that. They often had poor cohesion because they've turned up, but they've got no idea what's going on. And just to go back to something I didn't actually mention earlier to do with the Germans and the Soviets, because of previous fighting, the combat strength of their divisions for the Germans and the Soviets was roughly half, give or take. Some were more, some than less. German divisions were typically larger than the Soviets, but theirs were operating about half. So we're talking about 3,000 to 6,000 men. That's really heavily affects the cohesion of your units, particularly when you're in the attack, because you don't have as many men, and then you get new replacements in. They might not know their commanders, or you might get a new officer in, they might not know their men. So that really heavily affects the Soviet infantry's cohesion in attack, and quite often it comes to predictable results. So if we can move on to the next one. Another problem was that on the Western Front and the First Baltic Front, they generally didn't plan to do a large-scale armoured attack to cause a penetration in the German lines. And instead, they were often spread in an infantry support role. And now, of course, there's nothing wrong with an infantry support role for an armoured vehicle. The problem is that they weren't really using them at all very often to cause penetrations in the German lines. They'd quite often be used in groups of 15 to 25 or 15 to 30 tanks. The issue is in a lot of these offensives, we're talking the fronts, depending on which offensive it is, has anywhere from 150 to 250 tanks, and they're not really concentrating them very well to cause penetrations. On the other hand, Rokossovsky in the south, he does do this. He varies the axes of attack, but then he does also concentrate his armored vehicles into shock groups to cause penetrations. And then he also conducts training when he can in these short periods of time between offensives to try to get the infantry to attack in a united manner with the armored vehicles. I'll try and motor on because I'm conscious of time.
Oh, it's brilliant. No, it doesn't matter.
Okay,
but yeah,
cool.
It's good. We're loving it.
Again, it might seem that I'm particularly targeting the Western Front here with its poor execution. But particularly on the Western Front, it had it's insufficient artillery planning to neutralize German defenses, and everywhere, not just the Western Front, they were hampered by poor supply of ammunition. And in a moment, I'll get on to some maps, and we can actually go through what happens.
Don't worry about time. Just to interrupt you, this is the first big Soviet offensive. So if we look at the West Allies, they didn't get their first big offensive, right, or their second one, or their third. It takes them, if we start looking at, the North African campaign and Torch and Selenium. So it would be expecting a lot, given that the Soviets have been hanging on and defending and doing, they were on the ropes relatively months earlier. So it would be asking a lot for the first major offensive, even a minor offensive, to actually go perfectly. Because switching from a defensive stance to an attacking stance, it involves lots of changes. So it's, and with the distances and all the problems you've been outlining, I'm impressed they even tried it in some ways.
Yeah, I think as well, in reference to what I mentioned earlier, at the same time this is happening, what the historiography claims to be the main axis of attack, which we can talk about a bit later, is Ukraine. And in December, we do see the Dnieper-Carpathian offensive, which was massively successful. But part of the problem is that they're trying to do, effectively what they're trying to do is the Dnieper-Carpathian offensive and Operation Bagration at the same time. That's what their objectives are. They're trying to do both of those at the same time. If it goes perfectly well, Bagration actually says in his memoir that if this goes well now, we wouldn't have needed to have done Operation Bagration. But this
is the story of 1943 for the Allies generally, isn't it? This is that they're trying to do too much before they've quite got the resources for it. And then you get forward another year and you get to the early 45, and the Allies can now juggle as many campaigns in all theaters they want, because they've now got the people, the resources. So 42 is the everything's on a knife edge here, and 43 is the Allies have got the ball rolling, but don't always have the ability to do all the things they want to do at the same time. They're waiting for everything to catch up. So it's interesting that, because I'm not an Eastern Front guy, that I'm seeing and hearing all these echoes with the Pacific campaign, the Iron Hopping campaign. I'm thinking about Italy. It all connects.
So from what I got to about the artillery planning, we get to late December, January, which is a bit of a, you could split it into two distinct phases, really, this offensive. And the Stavka has a bit of a pause, and whilst the weather is particularly bad, and it reassesses, and it sees that the fronts have achieved nowhere near as much as they would have liked. And they effectively split the offensive on two separate axes in the areas where they've had the most success, that being the north and the south. As of this point, it becomes even more fractured than from what it already is. It kind of ceases to be this effort to destroy Army Group Center and liberate Belarus. Instead, it's kind of consolidating the positions that they've already gained and trying to advance those positions a bit more. The issue from that point is that in Stavka's mind, the Western strategic direction, it becomes not as important, because they've decided, okay, we can't really do this anymore, so let's shift more of our attention to Ukraine. And as you can see there, I've got some statistics. In January 44, in terms of the all available reserves to the Red Army at this point, they received 19% of infantry, 25% of artillery, and 4% of armor. So they're receiving healthy amounts of infantry and artillery reserves, but not in armor. And that's kind of the issue, because when they're suffering casualties, that 4% is only really going to be replacing those casualties. It's not going to be boosting those numbers up anymore to get a stronger armored force. And I will talk more in detail about the various arms of the Germans and the Soviets, their armor and their artillery. But that kind of just gives an idea in terms of planning how much influence the Stavka has, because we do talk a lot about how the Stavka has the ability to exert its influence over its fronts when it wants to. By using the Stavka Reserve, it can choose to dedicate the Stavka Reserve to the front that it deems to be the most important front or main axis of attack, which is what we see in Operation Bagration. We see the Stavka dedicates a huge amount of its infantry, of its artillery, of its logistics support, of its armor. And in this, because we've got two simultaneous large-scale offensives on two strategic directions, it can't direct all of its reserves in one direction, because it would be reckless for them to simply abandon one of the fronts. They still have to provide reserves to them, but then of course that's never going to be enough for the people who are there at the time. Because Rokossovsky says,
I mean, as you're saying, you're making a comparison. A year later, they could have more of a kind of a cavalier approach to things, because there's a little bit less risk involved. Whereas at this point, it still could all unravel. And as you said there, when it starts becoming a bit static, you start hemorrhaging casualties and hemorrhaging armor, as you said, the point there. So it's this is really fascinating.
Because Rokossovsky says in his memoir that in January, he says really bluntly in a sentence at the end of a paragraph, my objectives have remained the same. I have received practically nothing from Stavka, which is, you could read into that. Maybe it's because it's translated into English and it reads differently. But at the very least, that's quite a succinct way of summarizing what he's been told to do. Just to kind of conclude the planning before we get on some maps, it all's a bit disjointed, and they're not given enough time. And across the three fronts, the three front commanders, they're not all on the same score sheet. They don't all share the same kind of principles as each other, which can present its own problems. So if we move on to the next one, the next two slides are actually these are all of the constituent offensives that actually make up this offensive, just to try to quantify it a bit more and make it a bit more understandable. This one offensive, it's not like your Operation Bagration, where it's pretty much one big go and then you expand and then they expand from there after it succeeds. This is a lot of offensives that last maybe 2 to 3 weeks. It doesn't achieve the objective, and then they try again. So you can see on this page there's 5 Orsha offensives, all done by the Western Front. There's how many on this page? There's 4 Vitebsk offensives on this page, all done by the First Baltic Front. And the start, you can see with a lot of the start dates, none of them really line up with each other. The first Orsha offensive and the first Vitebsk offensive start on the 3rd of October. They start together, but then very quickly they finish on different dates, and then the subsequent ones they then start on different dates, and that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about it all just becoming a bit disjointed. And then if we go on to the next slide, moving into the second phase, if you want to split it down that way, we've got even more. We've then got even more. There's another Orsha offensive, and then there's even more Vitebsk offensives, but at this point the Stavka has told the Western Front to give up on Orsha because it's not done very well, and help at Vitebsk as well. So there's a huge amount of these offensives, and it kind of goes back to the fact that if they'd had a bit more of an operational pause to begin with, they wouldn't have had to have conducted so many offensives, because when one of them fails, it's okay, let's try again. Okay, let's try again. Okay, let's try again. That happens a lot of times.
And I'm assuming that the word offensive is open to interpretation. Some are more like putting pressure on, and some are like more dynamic. I mean, like the 100 different Eskimo words for snow. I mean, they can't all be these offensive barreling out the gates trying to cut. They must be at varying levels of oomph, for want of a better word.
Yes, they are. Well, on paper, they're supposed to be these, really coming out the gates. But as we start to get to the end of January and February, the First Baltic Front and the Western Front, their armored losses have been rather severe. So there's accounts from 3rd Panzer Army and basically just saying they don't seem to be using as many tanks anymore, and they suspect that's because of the losses they've taken earlier on in the month, and that's true. It kind of course, when you have a failed offensive, if you want to use that word, we can get into the definition of that as well at the end. It means you take losses. So when you try again, you're trying to do the same or a similar thing, but you're trying to do it with less stuff than you did before. So
yeah. And even if these were all working perfectly, you would still have the logistics problem of replacing the stuff you use, even in an attack or an offensive that you would consider 100% successful. It's still going to be using up stuff. So, you know, the sheer number there of mini offensives, although I'm using that word sarcastically, as part of a larger, it's mind blowing.
Yep, there are a lot of them, and even on the Belarusian front, which is Rokossovsky's front, where he's markedly more successful, which we'll have a look at in a minute, he's still conducting quite a lot of offensives. On this page alone, there's 4 there.
Yeah.
So that's just from the end of December to March.
Wow.
So if we go on to the next one, we've got some maps finally. It's worth mentioning before we get into it on these maps that these are actually German maps, so they don't conform to the Soviet pacing of their offensive. So some of them might cut off when a Soviet offensive is happening, but I can mention that when we get to it. And in the bottom right there, those are German predictions for Soviet losses. However, I would say that particularly armored losses, they're quite unreliable. So I thought I'd leave them on there, but I wouldn't take the armored losses that they say the Soviets are suffering as actual fact, because there's a lot of discrepancy. So what we can see here is, and I'll start from north to south, in the Kalinin front, which will very shortly be renamed the First Baltic Front. They commenced their offensive in the Vitebsk direction, which is their primary objective. They make a little bit of ground, but they actually have the most success towards Nevel, which is the top there. Part of the reason for that was because it was supposed to be a diversionary attack in support of Vitebsk, but by the dint of that being a diversionary attack, the German defenses there also weren't as heavy, and they had weaker Luftwaffe field divisions in that area. They breached through, and they have more success there. The issue is that Vitebsk was the primary objective, and it looks relatively decent to begin with, but they struggle in that main area, and the Stavka becomes increasingly more frustrated by Yeremenko, the front commander, because they see it that he has failed to exploit the Nevel breakout. But I can kind of sympathize with him a little bit, because he's trying to manage a breakout whilst also trying to conduct an offensive towards Vitebsk, which was the main direction. And then below that, the Western Front, it conducts its initial offensive towards Orsha, and you can see that it initially has a bit of success. The issue is that this map is from the start of October to the end of October. The initial success that the Western Front has towards Orsha is actually in that first Orsha offensive, in that first 10-day period. So for the rest of the month, basically nothing happens. They still conduct offensives, but they don't get anywhere. They also conduct offensives in the Mogilev direction as well, but you can see those arrows there, they basically just bounce off. And in the south, Rokossovsky's Central Front, which will soon be renamed the Belarusian Front, in this area, you can see it's a lot more of a network of rivers. There's the Dnieper River, which then splinters off into the Soz River. And then also this is the area of the Pripyat marshes. So it's marshy wetland, very difficult to traverse. And also, as we've talked about, it's October, November, it's very wet, making it incredibly precarious. So, and initially the gains aren't particularly huge. The issue is that they're having to conduct a river crossing followed by another river crossing, potentially depending on their direction of attack. So they're a little bit slower to begin with. Which Gommel, which is the town there with that little salient, that is the initial objective. And instead, Rokossovsky decides to conduct an attack towards Gommel, mainly as a diversion, and to then conduct an attack towards Loev in the south, which is where he decides to outflank the river. But because by outflanking the river, he can then place the Germans defending Gommel in that little gap between the Soz and the Dnieper in a precarious position. Why try to conduct two river crossings that are being defended by the Germans if you can simply outflank it? And that's what he decides to do. So if we move on to the next one. This covers the most of November. I'll start from the north again. They from here, this is where continuing attacks that are then towards Vitebsk, but as you can see, they just don't really get very far again, but they continue to expand the bridgehead that they had around Neville. Now this becomes more of kind of a focal point, shall we say, in expanding that bridgehead, because you can see there is an opportunity to perhaps encircle the German defenders in that gap north of Vitebsk. And from at this point, we get the Germans, which I will cover a bit more later. We get Hitler. He's reluctant to allow some of the German divisions to retreat, and by delaying that, it allows one of the stronger divisions of 3rd Panzer Army. It just gets completely mauled. It loses about half of its men, loses a third of its horses, and all of its towed guns. And if they had been able to retreat when they'd have liked to, then perhaps that wouldn't have happened. But I'll get onto the defensive doctrine stuff a bit later. And you can see in the Western Front, more Orsha offensives happen and they just bounce off. And then in the south, this is when we get the kind of the second phase of the Gommel-Rashitsa offensive. And that arrow there, this pretty much cuts off, this map cuts off when the breakthrough really occurs. So, and if we move on to the next map, you can see that the result of that is a much larger breakthrough for Rokossovsky's forces in the south. And as he moves closer towards his primary objective of Bobruisk, and then also trying to push towards Rogachev as well. And they also finally capture Gommel in the south, because the situation becomes untenable for the Germans there. So at this point, they register quite significant gains. Rokossovsky's front does. And in the north, First Baltic continues to kind of expand that bridgehead around Neville, and we start to get the salient around Vitebsk. And from the point of this map, this is when the Stavka orders the Western Front to start contributing a southern attack towards Vitebsk to help, because it's becoming increasingly frustrated with its lack of failure towards Orsha. And then on the next map, we can see that again, more attacks to try to kind of close that gap around Vitebsk, but not really much happening there. And then in the south, Rokossovsky's front, he continues to expand, pushing further around, getting closer to Rogachev, getting close to Bobruisk. And as we make our way onto the final map, this is a bit of a continuation of those same offensives, again, trying to expand those bridgeheads. And towards the end, Rokossovsky's forces, they capture Rogachev, and they breach the Dnieper River. And this crucially puts him on both flanks of the Berezina River, which will be that that infamous or famous, whatever you would like to use, debate for Operation Bagration about Rokossovsky conducting his two-pronged attack on Bobruisk. That is basically enabled because of what he does now. He's able to get his forces either side of the Berezina River at this point. And at the very end, on the Western Front as well, they conduct one last go at trying to capture Orsha, and again they bounce off. And on the next map, I've kind of got a bit of a crude before and after, because there aren't really many maps of a before and after. So this is what I did myself, and it just kind of displays that what happened between the fronts throughout this period. And in the south, across a 100-kilometer front, Rokossovsky's advanced up to 130 kilometers. So we're talking quite a significant distance, really, considering all of the stuff that we've mentioned previously with the poor weather and the not significant operational pause. And in the north, there's quite a significant territorial advance from where they initially were. The problem is that Vitebsk was always the primary objective for the First Baltic Front, and they'd failed to capture it. And then in the middle, unfortunately for the Soviets, just absolutely nothing has happened there. And there is a little bit later on, we'll talk about some of the reasons why that happened and the Stavka's thoughts on it. But if we move on to the next one, we can talk about the Germans on the defensive and how they actually conducted this defense. So that dotted line is the Panther position that they're occupying, and that's about 600 kilometers. However, the front, including all of its bows and kinks, was more like 700 kilometers. And because Hitler had decided to resurrect the idea of these positions in August, Army Group Centre had about 2 months to build these defences. So it was quite a formidable defence. It wasn't a continuous trench, but in large areas it was. There were trench defences. And these defensive lines, ideally they would be 3 defensive lines. There would be the forward position, the combat outpost, and then there'd be the main line with the bulk of forces at the back. So that would be 3 lines plus an artillery trench to the rear. But because of manpower shortages, they would typically have 1 or 2 trenches.
Right.
But some of the heavier defended areas like Vitebsk and Orsha, and by dint of the fact that they'd been fighting there for long periods because the Germans had held on to them, they had about 3 belts of trenches, and then within each belt they would have 2 or 3 trench lines. So we're talking a lot of deeply echeloned significant defense that has been built there. They would typically construct a reserve defense, but they wouldn't have a deep within 5 to 10 kilometers, but they wouldn't have deep reserve positions. So if it all came crumbling down, they wouldn't have anywhere to fall back to. And they would also, when they could, they would use villages and towns as strong points. They would either anchor their defenses with them, or they would, if they were falling back, they would use them to delay, cause additional casualties, and then fall back further. And just to kind of give an idea of how widely the Germans were spread, it was deemed acceptable for them to have 1 division per 15 kilometers, but in reality, they had about 1 per 25.
Good grief. That's insane.
Yeah.
An under-strength division at that, I imagine, as well. Yeah.
Yeah, which is something that I found just particularly staggering, was that in 3rd Panzer Army, they had some divisions in areas that were considered, quote, passive areas. They had a man every 50 to 80 meters, which, so you could stand in a trench and you look to your right and you look to your left, and you'd probably have to shout to talk to the next person, considering how far apart you are from them. Without going on too much of a side tangent, I just wanted to address, because it always comes up, Hitler's role in German defensive doctrine. And at this point throughout this offensive, we see an evolution from his stand fast orders to his fortress policy. And throughout most of the offensive, we've got him basically maintaining his stand fast orders. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes he might say, Bush would ask Hitler whether he was allowed to withdraw men, and Hitler would say to Bush, "You're not allowed to." And then Bush, of course, would then say to his army commanders, "You're not allowed to," without taking any agency. But the problem for the Germans was that particularly in areas like Vitebsk and Orsha, where the defense was becoming more successful, it began to push Hitler towards this fortress policy. I wouldn't say push. I'd say inform would probably be a better word to use, because these defenses had been successful. The discussion then arose in turning them into fortresses, because they kind of already were in all but name throughout this offensive. If they had 3 belts of trenches within each 3 trench lines, that's not much different from Operation Bagration. They don't really have to do much more. And that's kind of we get towards the start of February, we get that discussion, and then towards the end of February, Vitebsk is specifically, but then the other ones all are as well, declared as fortresses from that point. And there's a lot of pushback from Reinhardt, 3rd Panzer Army's commander at Vitebsk, but Bush basically just says that it's what Führer's commanded. So I know it's not ideal, but there you go. That's what you have to work with. So if we move on to the next slide, it's just a little bit into how the Germans actually conducted their defense. Because of manpower shortages, they often employed a static defense, even though you hear about German generals saying, "Oh, Hitler didn't let us do elastic defense. He restricted our maneuver, so on and so on." And the reality of this was this came from the reality of the front, I should say, and generally there was a patchwork of compromises that they had to come up with in the defense. There wasn't really any kind of strict strict doctrine of what they should conform to, because the idea of elastic defense was a First World War idea that had somewhat persisted but wasn't really official in any way. So generally, it was the agency of the commanders at the tactical level. So we're talking like battalion and divisional level, on how they wanted to conduct their defense. And typically that they would do a static defense because they had manpower shortages, which led them to having maybe 1 or 2 trenches. So they couldn't realistically conduct an elastic defense without defense in depth. And also, if you don't have enough men, it's quite risky trying to do an elastic defense. If you're being asked to sit in the front trench and fall back under Soviet artillery fire and you get it wrong, most of those men are going to be wounded or killed. It's a lot safer to sit in a static defense, which is what they often did. Whether they did a static or elastic defense, the common denominator was the counterattack, and they considered it to be the most important element of the defense. And typically that would mean that the small amount of armor that the Germans have would be held as a reserve at the artillery trench with a small amount of infantry, and then they would then counterattack from that position in any area that they deemed to be necessary at crisis points, for example. The artillery trench would also sometimes become de facto part of the trench line. Sometimes they get pushed all the way back to the artillery trench, and then they would then launch an attack from there. In terms of armor in this defense, because it was deemed to be so important, that was basically just used as they were the tactical reserve that was shuttled around to crisis points. as the more mobile force. They would do this. They would also be able to move their reserves around, particularly between Vitebsk and Orsha. There was the railway that ran vertically between the two of them, and they could use the railroad and the road to move infantry units, particularly to and from. And they would often remove platoons or companies from passive sectors and then send them to active sectors. I just wanted a quick word on how influential Hitler was actually in this defensive doctrine. And I think when we talk about Hitler and German defensive doctrine, and indeed German generals, they often say, as I've mentioned, they bemoan his halt orders or his fortress orders, saying it's the death of maneuver and we can't do elastic defense. There's a Tippelskirch. He mentions in regard to Operation Bagration, but it's pertinent here. He mentions that Hitler didn't allow them to conduct an elastic defense, and then he references falling back 50 kilometers to the Berezina River. But that's not elastic defense. Elastic defense is having your infantry in the front trench, falling back locally at a tactical level, maybe 1 or 2 kilometers. Hitler doesn't get down to that tactical level of saying, oh no, you're not allowed to pull back a couple of 100 meters. That's not what Hitler was doing. And I think that's evidenced by the fact that the Germans were allowed freedom at this tactical level to kind of exercise a bit more agency with how they used their armor, how they launch these counterattacks, because these counterattacks aren't operational level counterattacks. We're talking tactical level counterattacks. We're talking maybe 3 or 4 tanks, maybe a battalion of men, that real close down. So from that point of view, when we're talking about this, he's not really meddling, as some German generals would say. He's not influencing this at all at this level. What he does exert more influence over, undoubtedly, is that at that operational level. He doesn't want forces to fall back, let's say 20 plus kilometers. But what we're talking about here is not that. This is much more micro level, tactical level.
And thanks for explaining that, Chris, because that's a really good way of looking at it. Because I tend to think of the kind of the operational level and that sort of general's level of meddling and not meddling. But the point you're making about at that sort of small unit level, the Germans have more ability to their commanders to interpret the situation as they see fit, and use terms more fluidly and use movements in less strict a way, whereas the Soviets are a little bit more bound by doctrine. Really good stuff.
It is still worth me mentioning, though, however, that 3rd Panzer Army, Reinhardt, he actually had said to his subordinate commanders that if any of them want to launch not like anything more than a tactical level counterattack, they'd need to seek his approval. So there was still a level of restriction, but that was self-imposed by the army commander, and that was because he knew his limits in regards to their casualties. He didn't want his battalion commanders just gallivanting off and simple stuff like that. So if we move on to the next one, I've just got a quick picture of a standard defense for the 75th Infantry Division, a German division, and this was outside of Orsha, so this would have been against the Western Front, Soviet Western Front. You can see that they had 2 trench lines and they had an anti-tank ditch, and then further to the back, that dotted line, that's an artillery trench. And then if we move on to the next one, we can see those white arrows, that's the Soviet breakthrough in that area. And then those black arrows there, that's the German counterattack. That's that local tactical level counterattack that they're using to kind of stem the breakthrough. And the result of it, I haven't included the second map because it's not really relevant, but the result of this is the trench line is pushed back, but the Germans, they construct another one just in front of that forward artillery trench there. So they can So they do successfully contain this attack here. And the account of this attack, it details how this is where they're pushed all the way back to the artillery trench in the main area, and they launch their counterattack from there. And it mentions how they do it with 4 Stug 3 from an assault gun brigade and some infantry. It also mentions about how an officer rallies some non-combat troops actually in the artillery trench, and they get involved in the fighting. It's very much an all-hands-on approach, at least in this account. But from what I've read and researched in other accounts, it's very much an all-hands-on-deck approach to not just constructing these offensives, even just launching this very small local attack to stop this Soviet attack. So if we get on to the next one, I've got something perhaps a bit more exciting.
It's all been exciting. We're loving it.
I will talk about some tanks now. So in terms of German armor, they had, at the start of the offensive, they had 6 panzer divisions. But these 6 panzer divisions, they only had 126 tanks and 50 self-propelled guns. And of those 126 tanks, they were mostly Panzer IVs, with still a significant number of Panzer IIIs. They're later joined by, in the second week, 20th Panzer Division, which is at the time the strongest Panzer Division, and it has 29 Panzer IVs and 3 Panthers. It's worth noting as well, I can't remember which one off the top of my head. One of the Panzer Divisions is actually put in very quickly. It's put in a Kampfgruppe configuration supporting 18th Panzer Grenadier Division, and 4 of the 6 Panzer divisions are in Kampfgruppe configurations during this offensive. So only 2 of them are actually operating as a Panzer division, as an autonomous division. And then the remaining units are largely self-propelled guns, and that will be Stug 3s. These 2 pictures are actually from all the pictures I've been using are period appropriate from the offensive. They do have small numbers of Tiger tanks and Nashorn heavy tank destroyers. These are mostly fighting between Vitebsk and Orsha. There are some Tiger tanks in the south, in 9th Army, I believe, fighting against Rokossovsky's forces. And because they didn't have very many armored vehicles, they were basically used to complement the infantry. They had their own important role to play, but they didn't anchor the defense. The artillery was the anchor of the defense, which I'll get onto in a moment. And they tried to concentrate their armor as much as they could in the main axis of attack. And as I mentioned earlier, they would move them around to these crisis points where they were needed. Something that is at risk of starting a bit of a fun debate whenever we bring up how tanks are actually used or were used in the Second World War, in something I found to be very interesting in this offensive, and it remains largely the same in Operation Bagration, was that the German armor was used very heavily in an anti-tank role during this offensive, and the small amount of Tiger tanks and Nashorns, they were in the areas that they were actually present. They were the heavy lifters in terms of performing that anti-tank role. They were very important. And as an example, with 3rd Panzer Army, in January of 1944, their armored vehicles accounted for 75% of armored losses of First Baltic's armor, which is a staggering amount, really, because they're massively overshadowing the any other arm, really. It's not even anywhere near equitable to any other arm, not even towed anti-tank guns, for example. And I just found that really interesting as well, because it is out of necessity, but that's also reinforced by their ammunition supply. You're starting to see despite the fact that the standard combat load at this point is 50-50, 50% HE, and then the rest of the shells in their varying forms, whether that be heat rounds or armor piercing rounds or whatever, it's 50-50 split. At this point, you're starting to see 60% to 70%, 60% combat load armor piercing, and you're starting to see 70% of rounds fired being armor piercing rounds as well. So they are incredible. German armor in this offensive is incredibly important at stemming Soviet armor. And of course, they do perform a vital role in the traditional role, shall we say, of providing direct fire support on soft targets and so on. But that is something that they're being heavily used in, and they continue to be heavily used in when we move into Operation Bagration as well. So if we go on to the next one, I'll talk about their artillery a little bit. Because they have radios, and a lot more of them compared to the Soviets, they can operate through a very centralized command structure with artillery commanders. ARCOs is just the short version for artillery commander, and HARCO is the shortened version for a higher artillery commander. And they could effectively have an ARCO coordinate a group of artillery guns, and then HARCO would then coordinate multiple ARCOs. So effectively, you could have one man, the HARCO, in the army command on the radio, and he can get hold of most of the guns available to his army, and he could direct most of those guns on any one point, even if those guns were spread out. So it gave them a lot of adaptability. And because of this, the artillery was considered the most important element of the defense for the Germans during this offensive. They basically determined that they couldn't maintain the defense of an area if they didn't have significant artillery support in that area. And just as an interesting stat there, 3rd Panzer Army in February, it fires 221,000 15-centimeter shells, which is 2.5 times what Paulus's army fires in September 1942 at Stalingrad. So they're firing absolutely staggering amounts of artillery ammunition at this point. And it proved to be invaluable at breaking up Soviet attacks and also supporting German counterattacks. And this can be evidenced by the fact that on the Western Front, on several of their offensives, amongst the Soviet casualties, 70 to 80% of their casualties were caused by shell fragments. So that kind of emphasizes how important that is for and how deadly artillery is. And another crucial point that I just wanted to mention, despite the fact that the Germans were outnumbered in terms of their guns, the intensity of their artillery fire was generally superior, and that was particularly to do with their heavy batteries in counter battery fire. There's Soviet accounts stating how the Germans were effectively able to suppress their own artillery, making the Soviet artillery less effective, and that became quite crucial in kind of getting that balance, trying to get the balance back in the Germans' favor in terms of how outnumbered they were in artillery pieces. And something I just wanted to mention as well, and I did briefly mention previously, was how towed anti-tank guns were completely outshone by German armor in an anti-tank role, and that was largely down to the fact that they weren't as maneuverable, and they were more vulnerable to Soviet artillery. That did lead the Germans to adapt slightly. They would typically try to use their towed anti-tank guns in the deeper defense, But of course, if the Soviets have identified where these are, they can still call down artillery on them. But that's at least how they tried to adapt to that. But they were quite heavily outshone. I'd imagine part of the reason for that was because even though at this point the 75mm Pak 40 was supposed to be the main divisional anti-tank gun, they largely still had 50mm anti-tank guns, which were starting to become a bit more obsolete. They could do the job when it got a bit closer, but obviously nowhere near as good as a 75mm Pak 40 that they were armed with. So if we move on to the next slide, the Soviets, just go over kind of what they were supposed to be doing on the offensive opposed to the Germans on the defensive. The core of their offensive at this time were their combined arms armies. And I remember when I first started researching it, I'd see combined arms army. I was like, is that a special army? That's just the name for a Soviet army at this. If you see a Soviet army, it is a combined arms army, and they typically would comprise of rifle corps with their supporting elements, but they would often have their own tank brigades attached. Sometimes they would have a tank corps attached. Sometimes they would have artillery divisions or artillery breakthrough divisions attached. And the whole idea of this was to allow them to perform the Soviet operational art that started to come back now in 1943. Now they've got that industrial capacity back a bit more. They've got the initiative a bit more. They're on the offensive with the idea of having penetration forces to bust a hole in the German lines and then send through the fast-moving forces, the exploitation forces, that being the armored and the mechanized and the cavalry units. And that's all great on paper. And when it works, it works well. The issue is going back to what we've mentioned before, is that this lack of operational pause, it just throws a spanner in the works to all of this. Because in terms of Soviet doctrine, the exploitation forces are supposed to be these fast-moving armored units, and principally that would be the armored armies, and all 5 of them are either refitting or will be in Ukraine. None of them will be here. So that means that the front commanders, they have to designate their armored corps to be exploitation forces instead, which is equivalent to a Western or German division, roughly.
Right.
However, these corps are also weakened as well. So they don't have this same kind of punching power that they're expected to have, at least conforming to doctrine. And then in regards to their actual, in regards to the infantry, they have a lot of problems with their replacements. They get their replacements in, but the quality of these replacements is generally quite weak because they've covered such a large amount of ground that enables them to. Partisans are now with the Red Army. A lot of the time, that just meant that these partisans were just they were part of the Red Army, and a lot of the time they would be returning wounded. But of course, we don't know what the status of that person was before they were wounded. Were they a partisan? We don't know how much training these partisans have had. So the quality was generally quite poor for these replacements, and there are accounts of multiple times of groups of 100 to 200 replacements being sent from the Stavka Reserve that basically have 0 training, and they're just being sent in from the march, and it happens multiple times. As we've mentioned before, that it has a significant effect on how they were actually able to carry out their offensives.
I mean, it's like you were saying earlier, and I know this goes into 1944, but it's 1943 in a nutshell. You know, that they've kind of got the methodology worked out. They've got the ideas are sound, the concept is there, the exploitation units, but they haven't quite got the quality of units to do it properly yet. They haven't quite got the quality of reserve. They haven't got the practice, and they haven't quite got the logistics sorted out. And again, that is the Allies in 1943 everywhere in the world at that point. They're kind of, the recipe is working now. Just got to practice it a few more times. It's really interesting how it all connects, which is kind of what my job is, to kind of connect it all. As Indy says, nothing happens in a vacuum. It's all these, the lessons have broadly been learned, but now you've actually got to make it work in practice.
Yep. How are we doing for time? I don't have.
I'll just keep going. It's fine. It's good. Yeah,
right, cool. Cool. More tanks now. So. Right, so in terms of the Soviet armorers, in regards to this offensive and their offensive capabilities, the majority of their tanks are, of course, at this point, the T-34-76. Crucially, they still have a decent amount of light tanks. They stopped making them in the October, but they still have a reasonable amount of them. So I think whenever we look at Soviet tank numbers during this period, we have to remember that enough of those numbers are light tanks, and they're not particularly fulfilling really any combat role particularly well at this point. Like, they have T-70 T-60 scout tanks at this point, and they are used in a scouting role. They're originally designed to potentially be used in an infantry support role, but at this point we see the T-34-76 being used in all of these roles. They'll be used to cause penetrations in the penetration forces. They'll be used as infantry support in the penetration forces, and then they will, of course, be used as the exploitation forces. The other problem is that at this point, Soviet heavy tanks are still the KV-1 and the KV-1S, and at this point, they really are quite dated. The issue being that the KV-1S is the newer version of the tank, and they actually lightened it to try to make it faster. The problem is that it's still slow and its armor was still not really good enough. So you just had this slow tank that's armor could be reliably penetrated by German 76mm guns. And as we've talked about, those were the things that were doing most of the heavy lifting in terms of knocking tanks out. Later on in Operation Bagration, we see the IS-2, and that's a completely different animal as a heavy tank used in a breakthrough role in the penetration forces. At this point, the KV is still an armored vehicle, but they are becoming obsolete at this point. In terms of self-propelled guns, they've got the Su-76 and they have the Su-152 as well, and the 122. And these were all generally used as providing direct fire support in the penetration forces, where the artillery might not be able to do so. They have these guns to provide direct fire support. And we also see the Su-75 in this period as that kind of stopgap tank destroyer being used in tank destroyer brigades. It falls out of service towards the end when we start seeing that 85mm gun put on the T-34. But at this point, it's that kind of in-between period where at Kursk, the Soviet armor got a bit of a rude awakening. And now we're seeing kind of a bit of a change where they're implementing a bit more capability to knock out those larger German tanks, and obviously the more numerous German tanks at greater distances. And I've already mentioned that they had comparatively a lot of tanks, but none of the 5 tank armies, and how they designated their weaker armored corps to do that role. The problem that the front commanders encountered was when to actually use their armored vehicles and how to use them, particularly on the Western Front and on the First Baltic Front. And this did happen on Rokossovsky's front as well. You would have instances where tanks would go in with the infantry to cause penetrations. But if that effort was not quite successful, sometimes the exploitation forces would be sent in to help. But then that means if a penetration is created, the exploitation forces are being caught up in the fighting as well. And then they might potentially get damaged. So then that hinders their ability to perform their primary purpose, to try and get that clean breakthrough. And that clean breakthrough doesn't happen many times in the entire war for the Soviets. So it's a hard thing to get. But of course, you're not going to be able to get this clean breakthrough if you're needing to send your exploitation forces to cause it for themselves, if you understand what I mean. But then worst case scenario for that is that the penetration forces fail to create a penetration. The exploitation forces get sent in to do so. But then they might get sent in at a point where the defenders are undisrupted. Maybe the artillery, Soviet artillery, wasn't effective at neutralizing them. Maybe they'd beaten back the initial forces. So then these tanks are just flooding in to prepared defenders that aren't suppressed at all. And then that further damages their armored capability and the amount of tanks that they have, because then they're going to get knocked out. We do see in the south, however, Rokossovsky, he does create these shot groups working with the infantry divisions to cause penetrations, and that's how we get the success with the Gomel-Rashitsa offensive when he covers that 130 kilometers. And that's kind of the model, really. That's the model for what the Stavka ideally wants all of its front commanders to be doing. But the issue is that not all of these front commanders are on the same page. Not all of them know how to use their tanks.
And we'll get to that in your aftermath and conclusions. But the fact is that what Rokossovsky's doing is proving that it is going to work. The methodology is in place. It's just that you've got to now have the right commanders, the right tools, the right conditions, and then it will all come together. So, and I know we're going to be assessing the how much of a defeat it is, or how much of a design, how much of the alert part of the learning curve it is. But yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, because he does show that it's possible, despite all of that stuff we talked about, all of the weather, the poor logistics, everything. He does show he does. I mean, even he doesn't achieve the objective set out to him by the Stavka, at which point you could argue has Stavka set him a realistic objective. But compared to the other fronts, he does quite well. And the next slide, before we get into some conclusions,
just before you talk about artillery, I bet there's a comment that came in like an hour and a half ago that I want to put up there, because you said you had no family connection to this. Well, we have someone in the audience who is. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce his name there, but he said, my grandfather fought in the First Baltic Front, 103rd Howitzer Brigade in the winter 43-44. There were several attempts to take Vitebsk. I can't pronounce that word either, but you mentioned it earlier. Vitebsk, whatever.
Yeah.
So we got someone watching whose granddad was there. So that's pretty cool, isn't it?
Yeah, that's great. I might be butchering it, so I apologize if I'm butchering the pronunciation.
Well, you're doing it better than I am. So, So back to you for artillery.
So at this point, the Red Army had a pretty good core of artillery pieces, and as we talked about earlier, they had quite a lot of them comparatively. The issue was that they didn't have very many radios, so their artillery doctrine was pretty much based around minimizing this weakness. So they would conduct. They basically advanced on the principles of conducting a pre-planned bombardment, much like the First World War, which would lead them to typically have 200 to 300 guns per kilometer of front in the areas where they were trying to achieve those breakthroughs, and which would generally meant that they would have a lot more guns in any one given area that they chose to attack than the Germans. But the issue with all of this is that, as I've written there, that the nature of a pre-planned artillery bombardment, basically, it hinges on how good you plan. It sounds silly to say, but it hinges very much on how well you plan the thing that's supposed to be planned. And if you don't plan it very well, then it's probably not going to go very well. and particularly on the Western Front, they had quite poor artillery planning. There's instances, it's quite fascinating actually, in Alexei Isayev's book on Operation Bagration, he has a couple of chapters at the start talking about this offensive, and he notes how the 203mm heavy guns that the Western Front have, they fire almost exclusively concrete burster shells, like bunker busting shells. But we're talking entrenched German positions. You want to fire high explosive, and for whatever reason, I don't know why. I don't know whether that's because that's only what they had because of logistics problems. I'm not sure, but that is one of the. That's just an example. You can understand why maybe it doesn't go particularly well if your heavy artillery pieces are firing the wrong type of ammunition.
Well, we did that presentation probably 4 years ago with Sasho about Russian artillery, bandwidth, and I would imagine that was one of the things he would have examined there. That they're either the factories are producing the wrong type of shell, or they haven't changed over to what they need, or they're not being able to get the right ones from the right factory to the right front line. But he always explaining it's not the barrels you've got, it's what ammunition you've got of what type and what quantities that makes a difference. And counting up the number of guns in an offensive is not the full story. It's what are they firing, how many are they firing at, what are they firing the right things. So it makes sense they've got some sort of overarching issue with logistics to do with artillery shells.
Yeah, and I think as well, I think it's worth noting that even when good artillery practice is being exercised amongst individual armies, not to do with any particular front, because I don't want to tar an entire front with one brush, because that's a lot of people, and that's a very broad statement to make. But even in areas where they had good artillery planning, they were still hampered by that poor ammunition supply. But which would then lead me on to, which is what I find fascinating, is that despite these ammunition shortages that they have, from the statistics, that little table I've got there, we can see that's from a period of March 1943 to March 1944. The Western Front and the Belarusian Front are the two fronts that are using the most wagons of artillery shells. They're consuming the most artillery ammunition. So they're saying they don't have enough ammo, but they're consuming the most ammo. And I think part of that comes from that issue that I've gone back to a lot of. If you don't have enough time to prepare because of a lack of an operational pause, if your attack fails, well, then you're going to use more ammunition irrationally to try to succeed, and then more attempts, so on. That causes more consumption, doesn't it? So, but I still think that's very interesting how you hear a lot that they say that they don't have enough ammunition. Rokossovsky says in his memoir he's continuously hampered by a lack of ammunition, and that he can't provide mortar and artillery ammunition in the quantity that he needs for his armies. That a lot of the time that manifests in a lack of an ability to be able to provide continuing artillery support. A lot of the time it's just a big initial bombardment and then a very limited active artillery support when the attack is continuing, which is of course not helpful when you've got the Germans raining down hell on your own troops with their artillery that seemingly don't have ammunition problems. So yeah, if we move on to the next one, we can talk about the get onto some results and some learnings. And so in the result in the 5 months of fighting is that we have 3 Red Army fronts, and they fail to achieve their objectives, at least the objectives that the Stavka had set for them. But 2 of the fronts in the north and the south, the First Baltic and the Belarusian front, they had done relatively well. Even though the First Baltic hadn't captured its primary objective, it had shrunk the defences around Vitebsk by 50%, and at its neck, the salient was 35 kilometers wide. And it also had cut off army groups north and centre from each other. They couldn't easily support each other at the front anymore, which is significant because at the beginning of the offensive, Army Group North was able to move 20th Panzer Division to Army Group Center to help and other divisions, but then as it progresses, they're no longer able to do so. And of course, as I've mentioned, the Belarusian front, it advances 130 kilometers across a wide front. The problem is that in the middle, the Western Front, it advances only 7 to 13 kilometers over 27 operational days fighting at Orsha, and 11 to 20 kilometers operational days fighting at Vitebsk, that's a lot of days of fighting, a lot of effort for not a lot of territorial gain. And the result, and I think the reason why it can be seen, I think it kind of, when we use the word failure, I don't like to often just use the word failure because a lot of the time there's loads of other factors. The problem is when you look at the amount of casualties, I think the amount of casualties that they sustain makes it really hard to justify the gains in some of the areas. Like the official Soviet canon, which is an incomplete list of all of the constituent operations, lists almost 600,000 casualties for the Soviets.
I mean, and that's a lot. No matter how you try and say, oh, well, it's a big fort. That's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot of people. And then Glantz in his book states it's likely in excess of 700,000 casualties, and I think that's a good estimation.
Yeah.
I noticed in the chat about aviation. As much as I wanted to talk about aviation, there really isn't very much on it, and also I think we'd be here for like 5 hours if I.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was going to briefly ask you because because Prik Butar sort of says that air power in the Eastern Front is like a bonus that you could. It isn't a game changer. But like Craig Luther says, no, it is. It is. So I was interested to know whether, I mean, as you say, we haven't physically got the time to conclude it, but it's certainly not that absolutely overwhelming decisive factor that it would be in somewhere like, Normandy or the latter states of Italy. So it's there. You can't ignore it, but at the same time, it's not quite as vital.
Yeah, I think particularly in this offensive, from the Soviet side, the weather is really significant. It's heavily raining a lot when it's snowing in the winter. In which obviously moving into 1944, it's only really at the end when you get to spring at the very end where it's all pretty much decided that we're going to wrap it up. But throughout the winter, it's there's fog when it snows. So it's very hard it's very hard for them to conduct attacks with aviation. From the German side, they do frequently use what limited air power they have to quite effectively break up Soviet attacks, and they use that with their artillery. Often they concentrate that in the area of main defense. Although, despite the fact I say about the weather in terms of conducting operations for the Soviets on the offensive, German accounts, they still, when they do mention aviation, which isn't often, despite the fact the Soviets have thousands of planes, which I find to be quite curious, they say that in the areas of the main attack when they're using aviation, it's like it's relentless air attack. So that is something that I would love to learn more about. And because as we were talking before we went live, you said to me, don't be afraid to say, I don't know. And that's one of those things where I know some stuff. I don't know. Maybe there's someone else out there that does. And that would be.
Believe me, no one's going to question your knowledge after the powerhouse you've given us today. So it's absolutely fine. Don't worry.
I hope it hasn't been a death by PowerPoint.
No. It's pretty good.
Just to break down those casualties, the Western Front alone suffered 281,000 casualties, and those casualties were operational casualties. So when they were officially conducting operations, The 330,000 casualties is including, quote, passive sectors, so when they weren't conducting operations, when officially they were over, which comparatively to their opponents was German Fourth Army, which was Heinrich's army. It's 38,000 casualties. So you could see just how it just really did not go to plan. It's just it's a horrendous disparity.
Yeah.
And even on the haven't included the first Baltics split of casualties, because when we get to January, the second phase, when they're conducting offensive with the Western Front, it only includes joint casualties. So I can't provide a reliable number.
I mean, to me, that the old idea of thinking that the Red Army is a blunt tool that doesn't know what it's doing, and it's so that we've kind of blown that out of the water on World War II TV and other things over the last few years.
Yeah.
And they are good at operational warfare in some ways and deep penetration, but they never seem to crack the how to do it without killing lots of people. They never quite get that one mastered. Whereas perhaps the British and Americans and Canadians do a bit more of that steel more than flesh type of thing. The Soviets, for all their brilliance at times, just can't seem to stop. And they've got in the sidebar people say it's because they don't care. It's because they ultimately don't care about that. I'm not sure I completely buy that, but it has to be part of it there, that they don't have the same attitude. But that seems to be the bit they just can't seem to cure.
Yeah, I think even if you can, I think you can have your opinion whether they care or not, but at the very least you can make the point that Monty in 21st Army Group definitely cared more.
Yes, I agree. Even people I don't like Mark Clark in Italy or MacArthur, they definitely did care about their people to some extent. People push back on Mark Clark. It's hard. I would imagine it's hard to find lots of glowy, buzzy, warm and fuzzy comments from Soviet generals about their men in the same way you would in the West.
Yeah.
But
I think that's personally why I have a lot of respect for for Rokossovsky and one of his generals, Gorbatov. He speaks very highly of him, and they do talk about how much they like their men. It's just this kind of relentless, horrible churn that you see on the Eastern Front, and which leads me nicely onto the fact that the Belarusian front, Rokossovsky's front, who was using the Soviet doctrine really how they would want it to be used. He had the most success, albeit in the most difficult area of the front, but he still suffered 175,000 casualties.
Yeah,
that's a lot of people. And even when this all comes together and it works, which is because again, this like I mentioned at the start, this is only half of what my dissertation was. The other half of it is comparing it to Operation Bagration.
Well, thank God we didn't do it in one show like you suggested at the beginning. Otherwise, we had to have had a shave halfway through. But yeah, no, it's not that I'm complaining. It's fantastic.
But even then, the Soviet, they suffer over 700,000 casualties when it works.
Yeah.
It's just time it works, and this time it doesn't.
Yeah, no, you can't hide those figures, no matter how much you talk about maybe some tactical brilliance shown by Rokossovsky. Yeah. Those casualty figures are the the smoke. The damning statement, really.
But on what you said earlier as well, the last thing I wanted to do with this talk, which is why it connects to Operation Bagration, the last thing I wanted this to do was for it to be ammunition for the Verabus or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because quite clearly, there's a lot of evidence today that shows effectiveness of the Germans on the defense and elements of cumbersome Soviet offensive capabilities, which is why it's important when we move on to the next slide to talk about what they've learned from this.
Yeah, and I think that's gonna be. I know I'll let you talk about. That's gonna be our takeaway. Is that it's. Yeah. I always talk about that when I talk about. Because I always bring it back to Normandy because that's where I live. Is you cannot look at any of those individual operations without looking at the one before and the one after and say,
Yeah.
look, okay, but have they learned what they didn't do? You know, so you look at Goodwood and Atlantic and Spring and Totalized and Tractable, and you can absolutely see the improvements. Whereas sometimes when I look at the German offensives in whatever theater, I see them still just, well, you're doing it again, lads. You did it last time, and even with the bluntness that I just debunked of the Red Army, you can, and you will explain, you can see the learning. You can see that, okay, well, let's try and improve on this. And I think that's the thing you can kind of cling on to about them, is that they're trying to get it better.
Yeah, I think it's easy to look at things in a vacuum, and I think as well when we tell stories. Like, for example, I mean, the conclusion that I make is that we need to look at this operation if you're going to talk about Operation Bagration, but not necessarily in the same book, because that would just be, I think that would just be a bit silly. Unless you want to write in a 1,000-page tome. So anyway, I'll get on to some of these lessons. So there's an inquiry in April that the Stavka runs. It actually runs an inquiry into all three of the fronts, but the most important one is the one that he runs into the Western Front, which is Sokolovsky's front, and it's pretty damning. They basically say across the planning at pretty much every level, and in terms of the use of artillery, reconnaissance, and armor, that they repeatedly displayed poor conduct at all levels. And the result of that was that they dismissed him. He didn't receive any form of punishment or anything. He became the chief of staff of First Ukrainian Front under Marshal Zhukov, which is where we kind of get a little bit of historiographical debate, because they're supposed to be friends or acquainted to each other, which is why, if anyone remembers how I mentioned earlier about how if I would have replaced any one person, it would have been Sokolovsky, not Yeremenko. But if Sokolovsky's got a friend in Soviet high command, you could make the point. You could make the argument that perhaps he wasn't replaced for that reason. There's not necessarily any evidence to support that, but I think you could make the case if you wanted to. From that, in terms of the telling of the story, the official history, it affirms the long-standing view, even in its most recent version, which I believe was 2015. It affirms that operations in Ukraine was the main theatre, the Dnieper-Carpathian Offensive, as the manifestation of that, and that operations in Belarus succeeded in tying down the Germans to enable the success in the main area of Ukraine. And on that latter point, it's definitely true, because they do succeed in tying down German units to enable the success in Ukraine. However, I think I would push back and argue that from October to December, in that initial phase, they definitely in both areas are trying. I wouldn't personally argue that either of these areas are the main area from October to December. But from December onwards, when they realize they've not got as far as they've wanted to, they limit their aims, and then they make Ukraine the main area from late December onwards. And from that point, I think that's when the Dnieper-Carpathian Offensive happens. And I would be happy to agree from that point, but I would not agree from the initial point. And I think part of that comes down to the kind of trying to push it under the rug a bit. And just say, we did something, because in the official history, it pretty much says, we had a breakout at Neville, we had a breakout in the Gomel-Rashitsa offensive, and we supported the main area of operations in Ukraine, which I don't agree with personally.
I mean, in hosting 1,875 of these shows, one thing I've learned is that if any historian or official report says well, it may not have done exactly what it was supposed to, but it held down troops elsewhere and then enabled a breakthrough or something to happen elsewhere. That is like your fourth. That's the excuse you use if you haven't got a better one. If it actually did what it was supposed to do, you would say what it's supposed to do. So you get that with Normandy campaigns in Italy. Well, yes, it didn't quite do that, but it did tie down these three people. And I think, it's not that it isn't untrue. It's just that that's not the best argument for something, is it? Like I went and had a nice meal at a restaurant. I wasn't sick. That's not great praise. I didn't vomit afterwards, so it was all right. And I feel that's kind of what you get in this. Well, this wasn't the main one. No, we weren't. This was never. No, we never intended this to be the main one. That always. My spider senses start tingling.
I think as well. You can make the counterpoint that the 5 tank armies were in Ukraine, but we know that they were in Ukraine from terrain considerations.
Yeah.
So there's always pushback. I could be wrong. I'd like to.
No, it's just interesting debate point. Yeah, definitely.
So at the beginning of the offensive, the Stavka, they thought that their forces were adequate to perform their mission, and as I mentioned, perhaps if all the fronts had performed as Rokossovsky had, it would have been more successful. That's a bit of a counterfactual I'm not a huge fan of, but which then leads me on to how responsible was the Stavka, because I spent a lot of time talking about the front commanders, but how responsible was the Stavka high command, Stalin? And as I've said many times, the lack of operational pause had a really big detrimental effect on the offensive forces, and that the only people at fault for that was the Stavka, because if they'd have just said to have a pause a couple of weeks, then maybe they could continue to do their offensive. But they didn't. But then, like also I mentioned earlier as well, we have to remember we need to remember what they were thinking at the time, and they wanted to maintain that pressure. From their point of view, they'd just pursued the Germans 100 kilometers. So and when that then leads me on to the fact that they had crucially, which is the one thing you should just never do in anything, whether that be sport or war, is they underestimated the Germans. They assumed that because they'd beaten them for the last 2.5 months and they'd fallen back, that if they following offensive, they would be weak enough that they would push through, which of course was not the case. And just a little point at the bottom that on that slide is that the period of the offensives was 25 weeks and 4 days. And during that period, they conducted 27 offensives, 28 if you include a brief German counterattack, which I didn't mention today, because of course there's always a German counterattack when it's going badly for them. So there's 27 offensives during this time. But for example, if they'd decided to have 4 weeks preparation and then 3 weeks of fighting, they'd have time for each front to conduct 3 offensives. Or 3 weeks preparation and 3 weeks fighting, they'd haven't had enough time for the fronts to have 4 operations per front. So, and I think it's like what you said a lot earlier on, like you having a pause and then maybe waiting to the spring to doing it again. Well, like that kind of wait, I think, is a bit too long. But at least in this case, they could have had a longer preparation period, still fought in these difficult conditions, but maybe conducted 3 or 4 well-planned offensives, give themselves some time to get the equipment, let the logistics catch up, and maybe do it that way. Again, we don't know what would have happened, but that's something that they could have possibly done.
No, it makes sense. Yeah. Final slide.
Yep. So, in terms of moving that on for some other learnings, connecting it to Operation Bagration, what they do is they broadly have the same initial objectives in Operation Bagration that they do in this offensive, but they don't make a point of telling the front commanders, giving them a strict time scale and telling them that you have to get 300 kilometers away eventually. They give them achievable frontline objectives within about 100 kilometers, 150 kilometers. And then when that's successful, they then expand the objectives, which is something that they do after the initial successes of Operation Bagration. And instead of doing a massive offensive in two strategic directions, they decide to have their strategic directions do subsequent offensives, and then within those they would do one large-scale offensive. So that way they're able to manipulate German strategic reserves, because they start with the Karelian offensive up north, and then they make their way down to Operation Bagration, and then they make their way down. But they do that in stages, which also allows them to focus the Stavka Reserve at any one time, at any one strategic direction. So even though at that point, Operation Bagration was the kind of main theatre, or that they designated to be the main offensive for the summer, they could still designate a Stavka Reserve to the Karelian offensive. And then when it's Bagration's turn, they can put their reserves there, and then when they move south they can put their reserves there. So it allows them to exert a higher degree of influence. It also allows them to accrue a lot more resources in areas where the fronts are passive, which is something that they're simply not able to do this time. The point that I make, that's one of the most significant points in my opinion, is that they decide to stick with Bagramian and Rokossovsky as front commanders, and they know exactly what needs to be done to succeed, and crucially they know their men. And from that they decide to split the Western Front down into two fronts, give each front one specific objective, and they also appoint Chernikovsky as the front commander of Third Belarusian Front, who is like a rising star in the Red Army at this point. I believe he becomes a front commander at 38, which is the youngest one. So we effectively, the case could be made that during Operation Bagration, the front commanders are amongst some of the best in the Red Army, particularly if you want to use Rokossovsky and Chernikovsky as examples for that, but that's up for debate. This time there's a high level of involvement from Stavka representatives from the very beginning. There's a high level of scrutiny. There are two Stavka representatives that oversee the fronts. It's exhaustive, opposed to there being a low level of involvement, shall we say. And also in terms of the just battlefield experience of the Red Army as a whole, not just in this area, because some units that were fighting in Ukraine, for example, do fight in Belarus in Operation Bagration. It comes on leaps and bounds, and as a result, it's a lot more well-oiled, it's a lot more well-refined. In the penetration forces in Operation Bagration, they have a really good system of how it's organized. They'll have minesweeper tanks, they'll have combat engineers and assault infantry, they'll have heavy tanks, they'll have medium tanks, they'll have more infantry, they'll have more self-propelled guns, all layered in this way. And that's kind of the standard pattern. There's no more front commanders maybe not being sure about what they're supposed to do. That's the kind of formula that they use, and they're a lot more well-oiled as a result of that.
And just to add about your commanders thing there as well, is that you say that they're now probably the best commanders that could be available, but my argument could be because they've been allowed to get better from their earlier thing. If you just you haven't done it the first time, and you just keep chopping and it's like like football managers. If you just keep changing the coach every 6 weeks, they don't get the results. you're not allowing them time to impose their ideas and learn from their mistakes. So I think,
yes,
Rokossovsky's like any good commander, it's about learning from what you do badly to then take it on board. If you just keep bluntly going in exactly the same way, that's pointless. But the best commanders are the ones like General Slim in India. It didn't work perfectly at the beginning. He evolved a leadership and a command style. I think that you can see that it's a bit of patience sometimes. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah, I think Bagramyan's a very good example of that. Because as we could see throughout this offensive, he takes up where Yeremenko was. We have to remember he's learning how to be a front commander during this period. And then within the first 2 days of Operation Bagration, he encircles Third Panzer Army, decimates it, and captures his objective. So the Stavka are vindicated in keeping him, and he, he's had his time, he's had his experience to get better. And just as a bit of a word on the Germans, because I'm aware I've not really talked about them very much in this fight, in these final stages. The successful defense in the autumn-winter for them in this offensive, you could argue it sows the seeds for defeat during Operation Bagration, because they're convinced. Well, I wouldn't say they've allowed themselves to be convinced in their defenses, but at least Hitler has, and to a certain extent, the front commanders know that they've successfully defended their positions before. Now they're been declared as fortresses, so they're kind of stuck there now. So they have a full sense of security, and there's an Operation Bagration, when the Soviets launched their offensive, it's a lot more well-oiled, it's a lot more well-planned, and that big push, it's that collapse that we see.
It's a rematch, but it's not a rematch with the same teams and the same lineups and the same abilities. It feels like it is if you're Hitler. Oh well, we did it last time. We should be fine. Same ground, same pitch.
It's like generally speaking, the Germans are doing their defensive tactics, which worked well. They're pretty much doing that again. It's just that operationally they can't. With the stuff that I went into about their defensive tactics was largely tactical level, but operationally, there's not much they can really do about this, about the overwhelming amount of force that they're coming up against. And just a final point to do with the Germans as well is that with losses on the entire Eastern Front in the winter and the spring of 1944 meant that Fromm, who was the head of the Wehrmacht replacement army, that's the same Fromm who commits suicide in the July.
The July plot, that Fromm, of course.
He had said that the Wehrmacht requires 1.6 million men to replace the losses, ideally, the losses that they had taken in that winter-spring period. But they could only fulfill 400,000 of those replacements, and that's not including the fact that they needed 270,000 men a month anyway. So the losses on the German sides and their requirements for replacements, it was really getting out of hand at this point. And that just makes it worse for the Germans in Operation Bagration, because they have a similar amount of tanks, but they have less men. Well, there we go. I'll stop talking now.
Everyone absolutely brilliant stuff. Well, in the end, you've answered most of the questions that came in, but a couple of things that just to say there is Ian was saying, Chris, is a credit to Wolverhampton Union. Hugh Davie, can't wait for the presentation. Brilliant opening show from Ian there. This is an interesting one, not necessarily for this operation or even Bagration, but Jim is saying, is there any kind of competition between Soviet armies? I would say, would understand that's more at a lower level, more at a, battalion kind of level is where your competition. You can't really compare millions, but is that would be your answer as well?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, because I think particularly amongst the front commanders, I think there'd be an element of competition naturally.
Yeah.
But I mean, I suppose it's from person to person. Like I mentioned with Rokossovsky, he was embarrassed by the idea of having to be a Stavka representative of somebody his same rank. But I suppose if you get a different person, that might inflate their ego. That might. So it depends. But I think definitely on an army level, or on a divisional level, I would say that's the same.
Yeah. And Sir Capo is asking about new tactics, but I say I'm extending the invitation for you to come back and just basically do a part 2 at some point in the future about Bagration and go into some more detail about specific lessons learned, because we've done Bagration with several historians, as you know, but not necessarily in what was taken forward from previous things. So it'd be nice to do a part 2 to that. So it's amazing stuff. And we had another question which I didn't earmark. Is when you went into this at the beginning of this study, by the end of it, did your understanding of it, obviously your comprehension of it was greater, but did any of your preconceived ideas get turned around at the end of your research?
I would say that the main one that I had was, I think we've learned a lot more now about how the Soviets had become really good at the operational level, particularly towards the end of the war. But then when I studied this, I was like, this is more of a counter to that.
Yeah. But I think it's what you said at the beginning. It's that you put it in a slightly different way that I would normally do. Is I think as people who are interested in history, we kind of have that one single timeline approach. And when this is happening, October 43, there are other things happening in other theaters that perhaps are drawing our attention. Whereas by the time Bagration comes around, perhaps that becomes more in our focus, because it seems to kind of follow Operation Overlord. So the West does and then the East does this, whereas this somehow falls through the cracks a bit. So therefore is not on the timeline when we're considering the progression, as you say, made by the Red Army there. That this is, I mean, it's both progression, but it's also showing up weaknesses as well. It's a mix. It's very much a mixed bag. This you can see things. Again, as I said, the kind of the principle is there. The nucleus of an idea is there. It's just not. It's not been practiced enough. The planning hasn't been good. There's not enough strength in depth to achieve it. And as you say, I think the critical thing, the key thing, is the lack of trying to do too much and the lack of a pause. The lack of just hang on. Let's have a break and rethink. Yeah,
because I think it's worth noting as well that at the exact same time that this is happening, the Soviets are having the exact kind of success that they're hoping for in Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly.
They've got 2.5 million men in Ukraine.
Yeah,
and they shatter army groups south to the point where it has to be split into 2 army groups. So on one part of the front, they get exactly what they want. It's just perhaps they try to do a little bit too much all at once.
Which again is kind of the 43 thing in general. But we will leave things there. So folks, I know you've got lots more questions, but we'll invite Chris back, because otherwise I need to go for a pee, if I'm being quite honest. And myself, I'm 56 years old. I've been sitting here and I need to go for a pee. But we'll invite you back for another one to expound this. Tomorrow, we're back into Normandy. Colin Foster's coming on, talking about the Scots Guards down near Comore. Fantastic action down there, Hill 226. Looking forward to that. We've got a Tim Cook tribute show coming your way on Friday, and Wednesday we're looking at Malta. We're looking at a bit of a counterfactual. We're looking at why the fuck didn't Italy do more about Malta before Germany even get there, which is a great show with Giulio, who hasn't been on the channel for some time. So as always, click like and subscribe. I feel like saying the kind of ambassador kind of, I will watch your progress with keen interest, young Jedi. I feel that you've started something here, Chris, that I feel I will watch your career with interest, in a Senator Palpatine kind of way. I said that. So anyway, been fantastic stuff. Incredible knowledge, incredible way of explaining this in a way that makes it sense to people who are unashamed non-Eastern Front fans are learning something, which is always good. So folks, thanks for everything. I'll see you again tomorrow. Thanks, Chris. Cheers. Have a good evening, everyone. Bye.